SABC News presentation.
And it's Women's Month, and we celebrate that here on Interface. My name is Thembi Samachele. Good evening to you. Well, gender activists and experts say South Africa has made huge strides in enacting legislation and policies to advance gender equality, but they also say that these do not necessarily translate into broader gender equality. They say that this has not necessarily transformed the daily lives of many women in South Africa. What do you think? On Interface tonight, we ask the question, how can we utilize the laws and the policies that we have to advance gender equality, and why is it such a challenge to empower women? Our guests are Dr. Jacqueline de Matos-Ala, who is a lecturer in gender theory at Wits University, and also Professor Bonita Meyersfeld, who is the head of the Center for Applied Legal Studies at Wits. And remember, as always, you can join this discussion by commenting on our Facebook page. It's Interface on SABC3, or you can send us a text to 33726. Ladies, thank you so much for coming through to our program tonight, and welcome.
Thank you.
When we talk about gender equality, I mean, you get all sorts of definitions, from the hardline feminist stance of the 60s to, you know, just equality in the workplace. But how do you actually define gender equality? What are we talking about here? Jackie?
Well, yeah, that's actually quite difficult in a way to do, because different, women in different situations have different needs. But basically, I would say it's a freedom to make a choice unhindered by societal norms and values, to decide for yourself what it is that you want to do, to have the freedom to choose for yourself without other people or situations constraining you in your choices.
And for you, Bonita?
I think very similar. The notion of gender equality is not dissimilar to the notion of racial equality, to the notion of equality based on sexual orientation. In other words, it's the ability to, as Jackie says, flourish, to utilize the opportunities presented to you and to explore your own capabilities without being constrained by preconditioned assumptions around what you're supposed to be. And if you think back to the very dark days of Verwoerd, when he famously said in the introduction of Bantu education that a black child does not need to learn maths or science, that is a constraint on one's individual freedom. So gender equality is emerging from constraints such as those.
But with apartheid, there was a law in place, or there were laws in place to ensure that that black child did not prosper, did not thrive. Today, we've got laws that do the opposite, that ensure that women are empowered. So why are we still talking about gender equality in 2013?
I think there are societal norms and values that, are probably more difficult to get rid of than a law. In a law, you just have to realize that the law is unjust, it's bad, it's unequal, and repeal it and get rid of it. But when it comes to societal norms and societal norms and values that are reinforced by media, by popular culture, it's really difficult to reverse those unless you come up with a movement that is prepared to confront that and offer viable, good alternatives.
So why don't we have that in South Africa? Why don't we have a movement from women? Okay, let's just look at what we ourselves need to do. Why don't we have a movement of women that are saying enough is enough? We really want to see what is on paper translated into action on the ground.
I think they're two...
Actually, you, Jackie.
No. Okay, my question.
Yeah.
I think because... to actually, it's really difficult to get, one group of women that speaks coherently for all women. We've tried that at the international level. It hasn't gone down really well, because then what happens is developing world women accuse, Western women of speaking for them, of deciding what they need and what they want. So to come up with, gender or women's women empowerment that is a homogenous group of people to speak as one voice is very difficult. But I think, despite that, we can all come up with things that we agree with, that these are sort of the ground rules. These are the basic things that we need to do, that we need to get together, that we okay, we need to unite on. And, you know, there are women that are getting together to do that. You know, we just need to increase that groundswell.
But Bonita, you know, you're never going to get that homogenous voice of women because we are so diverse. And, you know, if we're never going to get that, how are we ever going to break through and have that critical mass that you need? And also just that unity that we saw in our own country, women doing it. Why are we not getting that right?
I think there's a very simple answer. Most of the harm that happens to women, and you're talking about a very real harm, happens outside the public space, right? And if you think about it, most of our laws, most of our policies, most of our structures operate to deal with that which happens in public. So if you're in a bar fight, it's easily understood. You have witnesses, you have people who can see this is what happened at this particular occasion at this time. A lot of the time with gender-based violence and gender-based discrimination, it's happening in our homes, it's happening in our schools prolifically, it's happening in our universities, of course, and it's happening in our workplace, it's happening in our politics, it's happening across the country. And when we see it emerging, what are we left with? We are left with a he said, she said. And then there's one step further. What are you asking people to come and join a revolution about? You're asking them to come and join a revolution about that which has happened to them, that has violated the very heart of them. You're asking survivors to come out and say, yes, I was hurt, I was raped, I was violated, and go back home, perhaps to the compound, the home, or the workplace where that is happening to you. So how can you have a revolution around something that we're supposed to feel shame about? And I think part of the sadness of inequality in South Africa is that we don't have a voice around gender equality because we have to first recover from our own sense of what we need to be ashamed about.
And I like what you said about this happening between two people behind closed doors, because that's in effect what really happens at a practical level. So how do you, as a university, both of you ladies are from Wits University, and your university has been thrust into the spotlight yet again for all the wrong reasons this time around, and that is all of the sexual harassment cases that we're hearing about. When you have to investigate that, when you have to look into that and get to the bottom of it, how do you do that when most of what allegedly happened between those two people behind closed doors?
It's a great question, and it's so hard to do. And it's hard to do for two reasons. The first is because of a lack of evidence. And as I said before, it's two stories coexisting. Which one do you believe? Well, often you believe the person who has more authority. And yet in most instances where there is an accusation of sexual violence or gender-based violence or discrimination, it's usually by a person in a lower position of authority against a person in a much higher and often high-profile position of authority. And that makes it very difficult to come out with a he said, she said story that is believable or equally believable and has equal probative value. But then there's another problem. Think about what happens to a person who's been through something traumatic. The biological reaction is in a way to shut down, close into yourself. Your entire frame of reference is about survival. And the very thing that law and investigation requires from you at that stage is to come out and tell people what it is that you've experienced and to articulate it in a way that everybody else can understand, that you have to go through a test that is going to, in many ways, emulate the very violation that's just occurred. So for a lot of people, and certainly in the last 15 years, the majority of the clients I've encountered, it's easier to just leave it alone and walk away.
And I want us to, after the break, just touch on, from your side, Jackie, what do you do in a situation like this? Because you do want to get to the bottom of it. So if you have the constraints that Bonita is talking about, how do you as a university, as an organization, deal with that, and how do you make sure that you do justice to that kind of case? But we've got to take a short break. Remember that we do welcome your thoughts as usual. Do drop us a line on our Facebook page. It's Interface on SABC3, or you can always just SMS us to 33726. We're back after this. Welcome back to SABC 3, watching Interface, and we're talking about gender equality. We're taking stock, in effect, of how far we've come when it comes to gender equality, and if, in fact, the laws that we have in place can be translated into proper implementation on the ground. And we are taking your Facebook messages and also your comments on our SMS line. Ladies, we were talking earlier about sexual harassment in particular and just how difficult it is to draw anything out and get a conclusion out of it, because it is something that is so personal and so hidden from the public eye. But in your case, in investigating what's happening in your university right now, I still would like to get to the point or to the bottom of what do you do to make sure you get it right? Either one of you can take it.
Well, you know, I think a lot of times when I've spoken to young women, they struggle with exactly, you know, was it sexual harassment? Was, you know, what was it? You know, am I just being, you know, am I imagining this? You know, how far is it okay to go? Because then, you know, societal norms and values sort of conflict, you know, between, you know, what we think that, you know, men are allowed to do in certain situations and what the law says that they're allowed to do. And you know, when you have people within your society that, you know, have been, you know, charged with rape and with sexual harassment, and when women see how these things are handled in the public, they become very, very reluctant to come forward, because, you know, do you sort of in the situation, you know, want to become the victim? Because it's so often like turns into the, oh well, you know, if she was harassed, somehow you asked for it. Okay, there was something that you did. I mean, how many times do you hear, you know, it's what, you know, what you were wearing. Okay, you know, you deserve what you got.
But what does that say, Jackie, about the link between sex and power then? Especially now in our country.
Well, there's a very obviously strong link between sex and power. Okay, always has been. You know, where, you know, across cultures, across countries, you will notice that it is, you know, the most powerful, you know, people who have these kind of things dog them. And I think, you know, the question is that it comes up so many times that it can't just be a coincidence. There's definitely something between sex and, you know, and power and being able to do these things.
And for you, Bonita?
Yeah, I think we have to be a bit frank about our leadership. We have to be frank about the stories that have traversed the media recently about trade unionists, and I think that we have to always weigh in the balance two issues. On the one hand, we've got to have a proper procedure. False allegations are not a joke, but they are far and few between. And on the other hand, you've got to have an understanding that for the most part our system doesn't really capture the harm that happens to people. And there's a continuum here. There's a continuum that begins with this notion that, oh, women are really good carers, right? All women are good carers. And then there's the development of that continuum, which is women aren't very rational or logical. And then there's the further step in that continuum, which says, well, if she complained, she's not very rational and logical, and therefore she must have either misunderstood it or indeed inculcated it herself. And we're not actually, I think, addressing this properly on a national level at all.
What should we be doing?
We should be speaking openly and honestly about this. We should not be engaging in defensive strategies and suggesting that people are lying every time they bring a case. It casts aspersions on all victims.
But it's so delicate, but at the same time, we need to actually get to an answer on this one, because one of my favorite movies of all time is Horrible Bosses. And I love that movie so much. But one of the storylines in that movie is a guy that gets harassed by a woman, a female boss. And the question really is, where does attraction start and end? And are we saying that if you are in a position of power, you shouldn't even be attracted to somebody that's a subordinate, even if that is returned and it's mutual?
I think there need to be values around a workplace conduct. There's a vast lack of dignity and respect, I think, in a lot of our workplaces, which is why I refer to the continuum, because if you don't think highly of a colleague because they are female or any other immutable characteristic, you're therefore going to engage with them in a manner that is not respectful. And that then in turn will lead to an atmosphere in which really any behavior goes.
But Jackie, if that young man in that movie, who is a subordinate, thinks, I don't want to offend my boss, you know, I don't want to tell my boss in you know, so many words that really I don't want your attention because I might lose my job. What should this person be doing who feels that, you know, they're getting unwarranted attention, but it's from a person that can actually make or break them in a career sense?
Yeah, well, that's what makes the whole situation so really, really difficult. But, you know, in a good workplace situation, there would be mechanisms and ways of being able to address this problem constructively, you know, to go to a human resources person.
But this is the boss.
Yeah.
This is the boss.
But,
you know,
I mean,
even
in a
the
perfect
HR
world,
person will possibly dance around the issue. I'm thinking of a young woman or a young man that's watching this show tonight and saying, you know, I do have an issue at work, but I don't know how to address it. Bonita spoke about how these issues are handled in the public eye, and these people are seeing this and they're saying, what do? Do I just stomach it and just hope that I get my breakthrough and I leave the job or whatever? Or, you know, is there some kind of recourse besides saying, go to HR?
It's against the law.
Yes.
It's against the law to do this to another person, and it's never your fault. And you're going to find yourself in situations where it's confusing and strange, where you think that because you are deferential to a person who's either older than you or in a senior position, that somehow you have to subvert your own feelings of comfort to theirs. You don't.
Okay. All right, ladies, we're going to continue this just after the break, and we are taking your SMS messages and also your Facebook messages. Do keep them coming. We are back after this break. We're chatting to Dr. Jackie de Matos Ala, who is a lecturer in gender theory at Wits University, and also Professor Bonita Meyersfeld, who is the head for the Center of Applied Legal Studies at Wits. And we're talking about gender equality and all issues related. It is Women's Month, and we are taking stock of how far we have come in that regard. And let's just take a few of your Facebook messages. Mushodi Totela says, who said we're supposed to be equal? It's human invention. It will never work. Even in stature, a man is much stronger than a woman. Use your common sense. Okay. And Magane Mpela Doctor says, we can mess with everything else except for culture, which gave birth to ideology, which resulted in a belief system. I was raised with the belief that a man is the head of the house, and that will never change. Sibusiso Busakwe says, we must ensure that all people know about gender equality. And Gandom G says, culture needs to fit in with women and consider them equals. At the workplace, we are progressing, but our cultures can and should change. Very diverse views and perhaps reflective of what's happening in society today.
Yes. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think for as long as the discussion continues to oscillate around culture, we need to ask ourselves why it is that to hate a black person is a prejudice, but to hate a woman is a culture. And it's very difficult to rebut that, but then be frank, say that's not our aspiration towards gender equality.
So the fact that we've got the Women Empowerment and Gender Equality Bill now, it's been tabled, it was tabled last year in Parliament, shouldn't we be celebrating? Isn't that a really good thing, a good step in the right direction?
It is. I mean, it's good to have laws that, what's the word? Enforce all these practices, but you can't, legislating what people do behind closed doors is really, really difficult. I mean, we've had the problem when we came to HIV/AIDS, is that how do we reach people, in an act behind closed doors? How do we change the gender dynamics in that act behind closed doors?
Because essentially, Bonita, what we're saying is we need to change attitude, and you can't legislate attitude change.
No, but there is a gap. All right, so I think there's absolutely right. Behavior is the realm of the social scientists, and I'll leave it to them. As far as the law is concerned, though, there's a real gap between the legal principles and then the implementation. So what you're finding is, if you take, for example, a case of rape, the person goes to the police station, or let's take domestic violence. The person goes to the police station and says, I've been hit. And it's very often left to the individual who's within that structure of the police as to whether or not the law is enforced. The law says you have to determine if that person needs to go to hospital first, and second, you have to explain to the complainant all the provisions within the Domestic Violence Act and tell her what her options are. It's common sense, it makes sense, and it ascribes to principles of fairness and to safety. But it depends on the individual who's there. And too often the individuals within these structures, be it the police, be it the courts, be it the hospitals, will subvert the law to their own ideology. And there's an interesting point there about ideology. Apartheid was ideology. Neo-Nazism is ideology. So I would agree with that Facebook subscriber. It's absolutely correct to say there is a certain culture which gives birth to an ideology. But there are 2 points. Ideology is not immutable, and we always need to question what we believe in.
Will this bill go anyways towards changing what we are seeing right now?
Well, it depends, as Bonita says, if there is the will to, hold people accountable for their action.
Is there such
in
a political
accordance.
will, though?
Well, the problem is
South
that,
Africa?
up until now, we've been really patchy in our ability to really, deliver to women all the things that we've promised them.
We've got the Department of Women, Children and People Living with Disabilities. Surely that's a step in the right direction. Government is doing their bit.
It's not sufficient. So the department itself, there's a huge debate as to whether the department should be separate, and it's a bit strange, and I think still is counterintuitive for many people within gender as to why it was morphed together with children, together with people with disabilities.
It's a start, Bonita.
It's a start that should also be accompanied by appropriate budgeting. So we've seen a steady decrease in gender responsive budgeting pretty much since the early 2000s. And we've also, it requires something that remains a myth and an anomaly, and that's called mainstreaming. Either you take the person seriously or you don't. And if you take a group of survivors of some form of sexual violence or some form of gender discrimination and say to them, how would you approach it? Their answer often is very different from the policy that's espoused from on high.
What do we do then going forward? If we can't legislate attitude change, if we can't really know what happens behind closed doors, how do we really break through when it comes to gender equality in our country? What needs to happen?
I think it is a multifaceted approach. You need legislation. Yeah. And you need to have the ability to enforce and make sure that legislation is implemented. It's no good having legislation that never gets put into practice.
In fact, yesterday, the Minister, Lulu Xingwana, said that she hopes that the bill is going to help monitor, evaluate and enforce initiatives that are aimed at empowering women. Is that is that the kind of strong statement that we need to show the political will that you ladies were talking about?
The whole thing is that it needs to go beyond making strong statements. It's actually, legislation is one thing. It's to do it that is the most important, is to put your money where your mouth is, as the term goes.
All right, we've got to wrap it up. What are we saying in terms of gender equality? Are we getting somewhere at least? I know there's always room for improvement, but are we really advancing? Are we getting somewhere?
You're always going to take 2 steps forward, 1 step back. We have to liberate our own minds, possess our own power, understand that we exist and can achieve by virtue of the fact that we have individual capabilities, and not subscribe to a predetermined set of criteria because you're a man, woman, black or white.
Well, thank you so much, ladies. Very strong statement to end it on. And thank you for coming through to talk to us here on Interface. And thank you for joining us for this program. Thank you for those thoughts. Do keep them coming. Let's keep the conversation going. It is Women's Month, and let's go beyond Women's Month and let's make a change. Let's make sure that the things that we do talk about are translated into action. Good night.